Chapter 13. The Redemption of Torag. For as far back as I can remember, Dad had agonized over the state of his health. With his perpetually slender physique, indifference towards alcohol, and inclination for regular physical exercise, he possessed few bad habits. Indeed, his lifelong love of walking would often be the bane of our existence. Indulging a dual intention to avoid traffic and satisfy his desire to walk, many a Saturday trip into the town centre involved Dad parking at least half a mile away. Whereas Mum, Dee, Sass and I arrived weary and fretful without so much as a bead of sweat on his brow, Dad always appeared as fresh as a daisy. Only his consistently high regard for gravy-rich dinners and steamed puddings betrayed an otherwise active and healthy lifestyle. Owing to his altogether lively appearance, Dad enjoyed little sympathy among the rest of our family for the multitude of ailments he claimed to have suffered. Assuredly, each time he complained of a restless night or an upset stomach, Mum ridiculed him for what she regarded as his self-indulgent hypochondria. As if lamenting the prospect of being stuck with Dad for the rest of her life, Mum scoffed and responded that he'd likely outlive us all. Indoctrinated by her prophecy, to me its probability never appeared in doubt. Unfortunately for Dad, he cried wolf too many times for his complaints to ever be taken seriously, and eventually I joined Mum in mocking him. After returning from church one Sunday at the end of January, Mum and I found Dad in the lounge, cradling a bandaged finger. Barely allowing Mum the opportunity to remove her coat, Dad quickly revealed a broken cup while washing the dishes as the cause of his misfortune. Sensible to Mum's characteristic indifference, Dad continued that, suspecting the need for stitches, he'd attended casualty that morning. Whilst being tended to, Dad explained having disclosed to the nurse an uncomfortable sensation along his left arm, akin to pins and needles. Appearing somewhat alarmed by his revelation, the nurse advised Dad to visit his own GP. After doing so the following week, Dad confirmed to Mum the doctor's suspicions of suspected angina. Seizing the opportunity to make light of his indisposition, I asserted that I knew of a woman by the same name. Unimpressed by my poor attempt at humour, Dad glared at me and announced that his friend Clive had offered the same predictable response when he'd informed him of the doctor's suspicions. Suffering a double dismissal, when Dad revealed having been woken the previous night, bathed in sweat and suffering palpitations, Mum disregarded the suggestion as being all in the mind. Wounded by her lack of sympathy, Dad retorted that far from being in the mind, his condition was very much in the body. While events transpired to prove Dad right, another 3 weeks would pass before he'd call out, and this time for the only person likely to take him seriously. Apart from my rather unsophisticated attempt to be witty, not since the day I moved into Dee's room had I exchanged more than a few words with Dad. Ever since then, I'd decided to spend my time either outside the house completely or ensconced in my room, listening to music. With my actions successfully preserving the silence between us, it came as something of a surprise to find Dad standing at my door one bitterly cold February evening. In as few words as he could possibly utter, Dad asked for my help in unloading the bags of logs he'd bought for our lounge fire on his way home from work. Seeing no occasion for rudeness, I made my way downstairs and unloaded the logs from the car in silence. After dumping the last of the sacks in the lounge, I darted back upstairs to the comfort of my room and settled down for the night. To the sound of a female's voice sometime later, I found myself drifting in and out of sleep. In a state of semi-slumber, I laid and listened in the hope of quickly returning to my former state of unconsciousness. Just then, a strained voice cried out my name. With the desperation in its tone alerting me to some particular distress, I lifted my head from the pillow and listened. Before long, the voice cried out again with even greater desperation than the first time. At this, I leapt out of bed and opened my door. No sooner had I done so than another weakened cry called out my name, but this time from Mum and Dad's room. Seeing the bedroom light on and the door open, I ventured hastily across the landing and entered the room. Lying in bed in a fetal position, I found Dad bathed in sweat and barely able to speak. A clenched fist against his forehead drew my attention to his ashen features. Before I had the chance to fully assess his pitiable state, Dad uttered to me in a low and rasping voice to call him an ambulance. With his extreme distress no longer in doubt, I flew downstairs to the kitchen to find Mum already on the phone to the doctor. Sensing not even the slightest hint of urgency in her voice, to my surprise, Mum began to play down Dad's conspicuously weakened state. Appalled by her casual lack of concern, I motioned behind me with my thumb and growled at her to get off the phone. As she lowered the receiver onto its cradle, Mum eyed me warily and then scuttled back upstairs. While my heart pounded rhythmically, I grabbed the phone and made a hurried call to the emergency services. After racing back upstairs to inform Dad that help was on its way, I fled once more downstairs and waited anxiously in the dark in front of the lounge window. Illuminated by a band of light from the street lamp opposite, the clock on the wall above the fireplace revealed the time to be shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning. No more than 20 minutes had passed before the ambulance arrived, and 2 paramedics were stood at the foot of Mum and Dad's bed. While one crew member unpacked a heart monitor, the other pulled the quilt away from Dad, who lay naked and fixed in a fetal position. Sensing the need to preserve his dignity, I went and stood on the landing outside his room, closely followed by Mum. As I turned to face her, in hushed tones, Mum began to make light of the paramedic throwing back the quilt, which had caused the piece of tissue Dad habitually applied to the tip of his penis after sex to be made visible. Before I could berate Mum for her insensitivity, with his pitiful inquiry as to whether or not he would live, my attention became immediately drawn back to Dad. Upon his pathetic assertion that he didn't want to die, the paramedics assured Dad that he had, in fact, registered a normal heartbeat. Having overheard their earnest assurances, I watched in surprise moments later to see them suddenly strap Dad into a portable chair and carry him off down the stairs. In expectation of his being given a humiliating all clear from the hospital, Mum rushed to dress herself before accompanying Dad into the ambulance. Standing shoeless in the cold night air, I looked on in silence as the paramedics hoisted him inside. While they jostled Dad into position, I took account of the horribly confused look on his face and realized that he hadn't once opened his eyes. As the doors were about to close, Dad offered his thanks to me for calling the ambulance. Believing him to be unaware of my presence, Dad's words left me in astonishment as I watched the ambulance disappear into the night. Despite his evidently sickly pallor, I felt it better to believe in Mum's prediction that Dad's illness was all in the mind and he would indeed outlive us all. No sooner had the ambulance turned the corner than I darted back inside and checked on Sass, who had slept soundly throughout the night's events. With Mum's promise in mind to phone as soon as she had some news, I returned to the kitchen and sat patiently next to the telephone. More than 2 hours had passed without word from Mum, after which I found myself becoming angry. Buoyed by the injustice of yet another broken promise, I grabbed the receiver from its cradle and telephoned the local hospital. After explaining the nature of my inquiry to the receptionist, I waited agitatedly while staff fetched Mum to the phone. Without a hint of care or concern in her voice, Mum greeted me, after which I began to berate her for not making contact as she had promised. In an attempt to mitigate her behaviour, she explained that with Dad sitting up in bed talking to the nurses, there appeared to be no real cause for alarm. Sensing that she'd begun to succeed in alleviating my fury, Mum advised me to go to bed in readiness for work later that morning. Having believed once more in the truthfulness of Mum's appraisal, a few hours later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, I presented myself at work. While sitting at my checkout, waiting for the throng of customers, between bouts of intermittent fatigue, I became preoccupied by thoughts of Dad. No sooner had I dared to fantasize about his possible death than Mum's prophetic assertions brought me swiftly back to reality. Despite his cruel disregard for me, I couldn't allow myself to seriously consider such a prospect, no matter how sorely I felt tempted. In a desire to correct my earlier transgression and clarify Dad's condition, I telephoned the hospital during my lunch hour. Putting to rest any suggestion of his death, the duty nurse informed me that despite being moved into intensive care, Dad's condition remained stable. Sufficiently placated by the nurse's assurances, I resolved to see out the rest of the day at work before making my way up to the hospital. As is so often the way when attempting to travel anywhere in a hurry, I encountered one obstacle after another. Having walked out of the supermarket, I took my place at the end of a queue a mile long for a bus to the hospital. After 2 buses stuffed to the gills with standing passengers had whizzed past without stopping, the sight of a third, virtually empty bus filled me with relief as it came into view. Predictably, the bus ground to a halt at practically every red light, thereby doubling the journey time to the hospital. Having eventually reached my destination at approximately 5:30, I walked briskly across the sodden grass towards the main entrance. Once inside, I found myself standing in confusion before a multitude of signs, not one of which gave directions to the intensive care unit. Gripped by a sudden impatience, I ran to the reception desk and barked an abrupt request for directions to my intended destination. No sooner had the receptionist pointed to a set of stairs leading to the first floor than I found myself atop them and standing at the end of a long corridor. After being presented with another set of signs, I searched in desperation for the one locating the intensive care unit before continuing my brisk walk down the corridor. At the entrance to each passing ward, I glanced anxiously down for fear of missing the unit completely. Jutting out from the wall in the distance, I spotted a sign indicating the entrance to the intensive care unit, and suddenly I quickened my pace. Just then, as I was about to turn the corner, Dee and Joe came out into the corridor, clutching each other's hand. Her cheeks made wet by newly shed tears, upon meeting my gaze, Dee declared that Dad had died. At that very moment, the world and everything in it stopped, and nothing mattered other than seeing Dad. Despite Dee's obvious distress at the appalling truth, I needed to look upon him with my own eyes before giving way to my emotions. Turning back in the direction they came, I followed, utterly stupefied, behind Dee and Joe as they led me down a seemingly endless corridor. Upon reaching a floor-length curtain at the end, Dee pulled it to one side, revealing the foot of a hospital bed. At the sight of what I assumed were Dad's feet under a blanket, a sense of apprehension suddenly stirred within me. After making my way through, I stood in silence at the foot of Dad's bed, while Mum sat impassively alongside him. While struggling to absorb the spectacle of his pale and lifeless body, my eyes became fixed on Dad's rigid mouth and parted lips, which had drawn their last exhausted breath. Suddenly, the corners of my mouth curled, and my chest began to heave before the tears eventually came. No sooner had I started to sob than Mum stood up. Placing herself over Dad, she began to repeat how he wouldn't wake up before dissolving into tears, the timing of which I didn't initially question. Just then, a member of the nursing staff entered the cubicle. Upon seeing my distress, she placed her hand on my shoulder before I fell into her arms and continued to sob. An hour or so later, having left the hospital to fetch Sass, we returned to Dad's bedside in order to say our goodbyes. My face still wet with tears, I ventured towards him, knowing what I must do to make good our parting. At that moment, the last 16 years of my life with him were at once inconsequential. The only thing that mattered was this moment, the here and now, a moment which I would remember for the rest of my life. Placing my hand gently on his hair, I leant over Dad and felt the warm skin of his forehead on my lips. Whether out of fear, obligation, or as a token gesture, I had parted from Dad in the only way I knew how, and the only way that seemed proper. As Joe's car pulled onto the driveway, I became aware of a different reality, beginning with entering a house of which Dad was now no longer a part. With one less person to fill it, our house seemed suddenly much emptier and far less safe than before. After meeting with the vicar who'd called to offer his condolences, I settled down by the phone and began notifying relatives of Dad's death. Despite her disbelief upon hearing the news, Auntie Grace put aside her own anguish to offer me comfort. As I began to sob, my diminutive yet formidable aunt, who'd threatened to avenge me by biting Mum if she bit me again, treated me with kindness and compassion. Calling me boy and urging me not to cry, I soon found myself consoled by her soothing words. With the only people left to inform being Nanny and Grandad, I dialed their number and waited, expecting to find them equally as sympathetic as Auntie Grace. While Nanny's resentment for Mum had endured for the last 7 years, Dee, Sass and I had hitherto managed to avoid becoming a similar object of contempt. Until now. With Dad now dead, nothing prevented Nanny from finally severing connections with her wayward daughter and her associatively guilty offspring. In tearful despair as I delivered the news of Dad's death, Nanny remained unexpectedly cold and curt. Even with my disclosure that I'd arrived at Dad's bedside too late to say goodbye, Nanny proved her heart would not so easily be touched. Dismayed and somewhat exasperated as to what I could say to elicit a sympathetic and caring response, I made a humble request to come and visit her. Gracious enough not to prolong my hurt, Nanny offered a cruel and callous response that she had all the grandchildren she needed. With these few words, she had created a wound far greater and less easily healed than that caused by Dad's death. Without any desire to avenge her hard-hearted cruelty, I uttered a tearful goodbye and put down the phone. From this moment, I finally realized that I had never been loved or held in any real regard by Nanny, with whom I remained estranged until her death 18 years later. Despite the unorthodox nature of my past, I had never experienced death in any respect. With the advent of Dad's untimely passing causing me to recognize my own mortality, I felt reluctant to fall asleep for fear that I wouldn't wake up. Being unaccustomed to either the emotional or practical considerations associated with death, the 10 days between Dad's death and his funeral were surreal indeed. Chief among such unfamiliar practices was that of visiting Dad in the funeral home. In the company of Dad's friend Clive, with whom Mum had enjoyed her playful clinches, we were led into a cold and dimly lit back room in a newly opened establishment in Maidstone. Wholly ignorant of the natural deterioration of the human body, the condition of Dad's corpse filled me with horror. While Clive began to weep, I looked inside Dad's open coffin in shock at the sight of his sunken eyes and blackened fingernails. Accentuating Dad's disturbing appearance was the powder blue satin shroud with lace trim in which the funeral directors had dressed him. With the shroud also forming the lining of the coffin, for a man who spent most of his life in a suit, Dad never looked so inappropriately dressed. The haunting image of his sunken features I'd never forget, and would resonate anew the moment the pallbearers pulled Dad's coffin from a hearse the following week. On a mild winter's day bedeviled by rain, those who knew and cared for Dad assembled in the local church to pay their last respects in a service presided over by the vicar so favoured by Mum. As he stood before us, the vicar lamented the date during the previous week which, had Dad lived, would have been his and Mum's 17th wedding anniversary. Speaking of the sanctity of their marriage, precious few among the congregation who knew of Mum and Dad's turbulent history would not have recognised the irony. For the duration of the church proceedings, the rain continued to fall heavily. However, as if by celestial inspiration, as the congregation began to emerge from the church, the sun shone brilliantly through the blackened clouds. Providing a glorious backdrop to Dad's burial, above the deer park behind the graveyard, as if bound for the heavens, a magnificent rainbow soared across the sky. While the pallbearers lowered Dad's coffin into the ground, the vicar clutched little Sass as he spoke. Realizing my dad's journey through life and mine with him was finally at an end, I began to sob once more. Into the arms of Janet from Valley House, the one person who I believed had truly cared for me, I sought and found comfort.
Soft lips upon his forehead when time to let him go, be what he couldn't be for me. My goodbye beat his hello. Man of the house I've now become, and soon he'll be forgot. In time I'll come to recognize I'm everything he's not. I wouldn't wish him back again. He'll take away my peace. My cage door finally opened. Some kind of strange release. Callous words, they cut so deep, got all the grandchildren she'll need. Plunged her knife and twisted hard, then laughed and watched me bleed. She did us both a favor, my life's not safe in her hand. Prefer the certainty of knowing exactly where I stand. I wouldn't wish her back again. She'll take away my peace. My cage door finally opened. Some kind of strange release. Now's the time for adventure. Forget that you've been spurned. Know your worth and value. Mind well what you have learned. That life is full of every kind of devils and angels too. Some self-respect will see you right. Seek out what's good and true. I wouldn't wish them back again. They'll take away my peace. My cage door finally opened. Some kind of strange release. I wouldn't wish them back again. They'll take away my peace. My cage door finally opened. Some kind of strange release. My cage door finally opened. Some kind of strange